5,000 years ago, a being rose from the Persian Gulf and taught humanity everything: writing, mathematics, and how to build cities. The Babylonians called him Owans, half man, half fish. On the other side of the world, in Mali, the Dogon people tell the same story. Fish beings called Nommo, who brought knowledge from the sky. In India, the first avatar of Vishnu is Matsya, the fish. Were our ancestors visited by fish-like beings from somewhere else? Many people think so, but they are missing something. I actually know this fish, and I'd like to introduce you to my friend. So by the end of this video, you will too. Let's start in ancient Mesopotamia, Sumer, the oldest civilization we know of, flourishing over 5,000 years ago in what is now Iraq. The Sumerians told of beings called Apkallu, fish sages who emerged from the Persian Gulf and taught humanity mathematics, agriculture, astronomy, and how to build cities. There were 7 of these fish beings, the 7 sages. Remember that number. Thousands of years later, around 280 BCE, a Babylonian priest named Berosus preserved this ancient Sumerian tradition for the Greek world. He called the lead figure Owans. But the story itself is as old as the Mesopotamian culture. In Mali, West Africa, thousands of miles away, no historical contact we know of, the Dogon people talk about the Nommo, amphibious beings who came from the sky and brought knowledge to humanity, half human, half fish, living in water. In India, Matsya, the fish avatar of Vishnu, is the first incarnation. Vishnu appeared as a fish to save humanity from the Great Flood and preserve the Vedas, the source of sacred knowledge. In the yoga tradition, the founder of Hatha Yoga happens to also be half fish, called Matsyendranath, which translates to Lord of the Fishes. And these are just the examples we're covering today. The same fish being archetype appears in dozens of other traditions, cultures with no connection to each other. Now, I want to pause here. I know what you might be thinking. Ancient aliens, really? That's not where this is going. The ancient alien theorists take these stories literally. The ancients weren't being literal. They were doing something much more sophisticated. To understand what, we need to understand how ancient people thought about their origins. They weren't doing history like we do. We trace our family tree. We talk about where our grandparents came from, maybe go back a few generations. Ancient people trace their origins all the way back to the beginning of everything. Not just their civilization, but reality itself. If you asked an ancient person where they came from, before talking about their parents or their tribe, they'd tell you about how their mind came to exist. And they'd trace it back to the ground of existence. When they drew pictures of God as an old bearded man in the sky, that was symbolism. What they were actually talking about was absolute consciousness, the ground of being. Our ancestors spent thousands of years, their best minds, working on one question: how does infinite unified consciousness give rise to anything finite? How do you get individuals, separate things, like you or me, from pure oneness? Think about it. If you're infinite, if you're everything, how can you create anything? What could possibly be outside you? You can't. The only way the infinite can create is by making a boundary within itself. That first boundary, that's where everything starts. You probably know it from Genesis. The first thing God does before creating light or land, He divides the waters, separates them. But this appears everywhere, not just the Bible. The infinite wholeness splits in two. One circle, the first boundary, and another circle, two aspects of what was once one. When you draw these two circles overlapping, they create a shape in the middle. It looks like a fish. In esoteric traditions, this symbol is called the Vesica Piscis. Latin for the vessel of the fish. This is the fish we've been talking about, not an alien, not a sea creature, a symbol. The symbol of the first boundary, the first division that makes anything visible possible. The source, the threshold where the infinite touches the finite. This is what the ancient mystery schools actually taught. Now let's talk about Jesus, that fish symbol you see on car bumpers and church walls. There's more to that story. In this metaphysical framework, there's infinite consciousness, what we call God, the absolute. For anything finite to exist, for there to be the Son of God, consciousness has to cross that boundary, has to enter limitation. That's what the Christ figure represents in Christianity. I know my grandparents don't think about Jesus in this way, but the first Christians knew all about this. The moment when the infinite becomes finite, when consciousness enters our world. The fish is the doorway. They remind you constantly in the story. This son comes from unity. That's why Jesus is born of a virgin. There's no duality, no male and female behind his origin, just the one becoming the many. You might be thinking, okay, interesting geometry, but what does this actually mean? Let's look at the numbers the ancients embedded in their stories. They weren't just telling tales, they were encoding mathematics. Take the feeding of the 5,000. Jesus feeds everyone with 2 fish. We already know what those 2 fish are, the 2 circles that overlap to form the Vesica Piscis. But Jesus doesn't just have 2 fish, he has 5 loaves of bread too. Put them together, you get 7. The 7 Apkallu in Babylon, the 7 fish sages. 7 appears often in ancient cosmology. It represents how that first division repeats itself to create harmony. In Vedic tradition, the 7 rivers from which reality flows, and the 7 sages. In the Bible, the 7 trumpets, the 6 days of creation, plus the 7th day of rest. In my own native Finnish tradition, in the primordial ocean, the duck lays 6 golden eggs and a 7th made of iron. When you continue these mathematics further, you get a 12-fold cycle. 6 ascending phases, 6 descending. The zodiac, the 12 tribes, the 12 disciples. In the Jesus story, after feeding everyone with the fish and loaves, the leftovers are gathered into 12 baskets. It's encoded, right there in the story, if you know how to read it. Let me bring this back to something practical. The ancients weren't just describing the creation of the universe. They were describing the structure of consciousness itself. This is the ancient science of awareness, and it includes your consciousness. Right now, in your experience, there is a division happening. There is you, the one who's aware, and there is what you are aware of. The screen, my voice, your thoughts, your body. That's the fish playing out in your experience right now. Here's what the ancient traditions point to. That division isn't as solid as it seems. The subject and object, the seer and the seen, they arise together from the same source. The 2 circles come from one. The contemplative traditions I've studied, Tantra, Hermetics, Christian mysticism, the Nordic traditions, they all have practices for recognizing this, for seeing through the apparent division to the unity underneath. So what's the fish that founded civilization? Not a creature, not an alien, not a literal fish person teaching our ancestors. It's a concept in ancient metaphysics, the source of all wisdom, the doorway through which knowledge enters our world. When the Babylonians said Oennes taught them everything, they weren't talking about the fishman. When the Dogon say Nomma broth, wisdom, they are not describing space aliens. they are pointing at the same thing, this principle. We are only scratching surface with these wisdom traditions. Next week, we'll go even deeper.